the Great Amazing Book Show. We had a really good time yesterday with The Radish Cure. We're reading Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. It's a book about a woman who knows about children. And The Radish Cure had nothing to do with radishes almost. I thought that it was going to be about a girl who refuses to eat her radishes, but it was not. And so today's chapter is The Never Want to Go to Bedder's Cure. That's all one big, giant, strung together cure. And I think it has to do with going to bed. However, really quickly, use your imagination, close your eyes, and think, what else could the never want to go to bedder's cure be? Because there could be all kinds of things connected to it, and maybe going to bed has nothing to do with this chapter. Who knows? It's Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. We really don't know what she's coming up with. So, let's begin. Each evening, as the clock struck 8, Mrs. Gray called Bobby and Larry and Susan. I think they're related. She said, "Come, children, 8 o'clock and time for bed." Do you have to go to bed at 8 o'clock? 8 o'clock might be early. I remember when I was little, I had to go to bed when it was still light outside. Can you believe that? You go to bed and there's kids playing out in the street still, and you don't get to play. Yeah, it was hard to go to sleep. She tried to make her voice sound cheerful and gay. That's an old term for happy again. But actually, she felt like groaning because she knew what was coming. First, Susan. "Oh, we don't want to go to bed now. Please let us stay up a little while longer. Please." There's about 18 E's in that, so you got to say it a long time. "Mother, please." Then Bobby. We are the million O's here. Only ones in our whole neighborhood who have to go to bed at 8 o'clock. Then Larry. "Mother, nobody, not anybody at all," about a billion A's in this all, "goes to bed at 8 o'clock. Then Susan again. "But Mother, we have only just started this game." Then Bobby. "Please, let us finish this game, please." Then Larry. "Just one more turn, Mother. It's my turn, Mother, and I haven't won a game this evening. Please." That's enough E's, he says. Mrs. Gray said, "How would you feel if you were that mother?" "I wouldn't want to take care of these whiny little children." Mrs. Gray said, "Now Bobby, Larry, and Susan." I guess she's a mom, so she actually cares about them and loves them and stuff. Anyway, I'd just trade them in for something else. "You know that if you want to grow up into fine young men and women, you must have plenty of sleep." Very true. "I'm sure they teach you that in school." "We don't want to grow up. We just want to finish this game," Bobby wailed. And so, night after night, poor Mrs. Gray argued and pled and begged her children to go to bed. And by the time they had finished whining and complaining, it was usually almost 9 o'clock. Mrs. Gray was desperate. Finally, one day, she called her friend, Mrs. Grassfeather. I love the names of the people on the streets in this book. Mrs. Grassfeather, she said, "Hello, Mrs. Grassfeather. This is Mrs. Gray, and I would like to find out what time Catherine and Wilfred go to bed." That's the Grassfeather children. Mrs. Grassfeather said, "Why, at 8 o'clock. Mrs. Gray, why, at 8 o'clock, Mrs. Gray, unless their Uncle Jasper comes for dinner, and then I usually let them stay up until 9:30 to hear Uncle Jasper tell about his experience in the Boer War." That's in South Africa. "That, of course, is strictly Mrs. Grassfeather's. That is, of course, strictly Mr. Grassfeather's idea. He not only allows the children to stay up until 9:30, but he pays them as well for listening to Uncle Jasper while he goes to bed." How would you like to get paid to listen to your uncle tell stories? And good stories from South Africa about lions and hyenas and all kinds of things. Mrs. Gray said, Do the children like to go to bed at 8 o'clock? Mrs. Grassfeather said, Oh, they are very good about it because they know that if they whine and complain, I will not let them stay up the next time until the next time Uncle Jasper comes over, which is about 4 nights a week. As the Grays had no Uncle Jasper, Mrs. Gray realized that Mrs. Grassfeather could be of no help. So she said goodbye and hung up the phone. Click. Then she called Mrs. Gardenfield. A garden is in a field. Hello, Mrs. Gardenfield. This is Mrs. Gray, and I called to see what time Worthington and Guinevere go to bed at night. Maybe we have a Worthington watching this, or a Guinevere. Is anyone out there named Guinevere? That's a hard, when you're first learning to write your name, those both are very difficult names to spell. Worthington. Mrs. Gardenfield said, Oh, they go to bed any time after Daddy comes home. You see, Mrs. Gray, Mr. Gardenfield gets home at 4:30. We have dinner at 5:30, and the children, Mr. Gardenfield, and I all go to bed at 6:30. 6:30? Said Mrs. Gray, amazed. My goodness, that is early. Mrs. Gardenfield said, It is not early if you get up at 4:30 a.m. Mrs. Gray said, But who wants to get up at 4:30? She's right. There's not a whole lot going on at 4:30 in the morning. We do, said Mrs. Gardenfield, and hung up the phone in a huff. They get up at 4:30 when no one else is up and, play volleyball in their front yard or something. So Mrs. Gray thought, and suddenly she remembered that only yesterday Dick Thompson's mother had been telling her about a wonderful little woman named Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. And so, even though she had never seen Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, she decided to call her on the telephone and ask her to help with her never want to go to bed ers. She said to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, I am Mrs. Gray, the mother of Bobby, Larry, and Susan. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, Oh, yes, of course. How are the children? I have not seen them since they returned from camp. Mrs. Gray said, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, Bobby and Larry and Susan are very well and very cooperative until about 8 o'clock at night, and then they turn into whiny, complaining little non-cooperators. You know what cooperate means? That's a long word. Cooperate. Well, if you operate, you do something. And if you cooperate, like a co-pilot, there's 2 of them. And so if you cooperate, you work with someone else. And she means that they are non-cooperators, meaning they won't work with her. That's a problem. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, Oh, yes, I see. They are never want to go to bedders, aren't they? Mrs. Gray said, How on earth did you know? Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle laughed and said, Oh, that is one of the most commonest of the children's ailments. The moment you said they were good until 8 o'clock, I knew what the trouble was. Mrs. Gray said, Do you know anything to do for them? How to cure this hateful disease? Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, Oh, that's very simple. Beginning tonight, don't tell them to go to bed. Let them stay up as late as they want to. You and Mr. Gray go on to bed any time you are tired, but leave the children downstairs. Mrs. Gray said, But their health. That will ruin their health. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, Oh, I do not believe that a day or so without sleep will harm them, and it will certainly cure them. It is really worth a try, Mrs. Gray, but if you have any trouble and the cure doesn't seem to be working, call me. Mrs. Gray said, Oh, thank you so much. I will let you know tomorrow how we are getting along. That night at 8 o'clock, the clock struck, and Mrs. Gray continued to mend socks and said nothing about bed, and Mr. Gray changed the radio, and Bobby and Larry and Susan played Parcheesi, which I have never played. Have you played Parcheesi? It sounds fun, but I haven't played it. At 9 o'clock, the clock struck again, and Mrs. Gray put down the socks and took up a woman's magazine. Mr. Gray changed the radio, and Bobby and Larry and Susan continued to play Parcheesi. Then 10 o'clock struck. Mrs. Gray yawned, put down the magazine. Mr. Gray snapped off the radio, click, and Larry and Susan and Bobby began another game of Parcheesi. At 10:30, Mr. and Mrs. Gray went upstairs to bed and left the children playing Parcheesi. At 12 o'clock, that's midnight. That's when all the witches and goblins and ghosts come out. No. Mrs. Gray awoke and at first thought there were burglars in the house. Then she remembered the never want to go to bedders. So she tiptoed down the stairs. And there, at the bottom of the stairs, were Bobby and Larry and Susan playing Parcheesi on the living room rug. The next morning, the children slept until 11:30. About 9 o'clock, Dick Thompson's mother stopped by to take them to the beach, but Mrs. Gray told her they were still asleep. When the children finally got up, they were cross and quarrelsome. That means they wanted to argue a lot with each other. When their mother told them about Mrs. Thompson inviting them to the beach, they said, "Why didn't she wait for us? Why didn't you wake us up? I think Mrs. Thompson's mean not to wait." Mrs. Gray said, "I see no reason why Mrs. Thompson and Dick should have their day spoiled waiting for the 3 little members of the all-night Parcheesi Club to get up. Now come and eat your breakfast and stop complaining." They're eating breakfast at 11:30. That night after dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Gray went to a moving picture show and left Larry and Bobby and Susan playing Tiddlywinks. I know Tiddlywinks, you do too. In Ramona the Pest, or Ramona, Beezus and Ramona, she wanted to play Tiddlywinks, and they wouldn't let her. So she rode her tricycle into their game and ruined it. When the Grays came home about 12:30, the children were still up playing Tiddlywinks and quarreling about whose turn it was because they were very tired. The next morning, they had 9 o'clock dentist appointments, and so Mrs. Gray got them up at 8. Susan was so sleepy she could not eat her mush, and Larry yawned so much he choked on his egg and had to be turned upside down and shaken by his legs. Bobby just sat and rubbed his eyes. Like that. Bobby went to sleep in the car on the way to the dentist. Susan went to sleep in the dentist's waiting room, and Larry slept all the way home. That night, after their parents had gone to bed, Larry said, "Why do we have to stay in the house for all the time? Why do we have to stay in the house for all the time?" That's what he said. "Let's go outside and play." So they went outside and put on their roller skates and began skating up and down on the dark streets. Mrs. Milgram, who lived on the corner, came out on her front porch in her bathrobe and yelled, "For heaven's sake, don't you children know that it is almost midnight? What on earth are you doing up at this hour?" And they shouted back, "What are you doing up?" No. Larry said, "We don't have to go to bed anymore. We stay up late every night." Mrs. Milgram said, "Well, stay up someplace else and be quiet." She went into the house and slammed the door. So the children took off their skates and tiptoed back to the house. Because skates made a lot of noise back then. They had metal wheels. Can you think of the sound of metal wheels skating up and down? So the children took off their skates, tiptoed back to the house. They got out their Parcheesi board, but Susan said it was her turn for the pinks. And Larry said, "I happen to beg your pardon, but it is my turn." Susan said, "You had the pinks yesterday, and Bobby had them the day before, and it's my turn tonight." And she began to cry. Uh-oh. Larry threw the pinks at her, and one of them went into the fireplace, and they had to strain the ashes through their fingers until they found it. There was no fire in the fireplace at the moment. When they finally were ready to play, Bobby was asleep with his head on the board, so Susan and Larry played, jumping their men across Bobby's... Oh, I turned too many pages. Bobby's head until Susan, too, fell asleep right in the middle of her turn. Larry woke Susan and Bobby, and they all went to bed just as the clock struck 1 a.m. The next day, there was a matinee at the neighborhood theater. That means a show earlier in the day. They're usually less expensive and fun to go to with a bunch of kids. I grew up going to matinee movies at the Liberty Theater when I was a little boy, and it was an old theater, and it was really great. So they didn't want to miss this show. You know what's actually interesting? This is a sidebar. I'm sorry, I get distracted, but the Liberty Theater that I went to as a little boy, they don't show movies there anymore. They remodeled the whole thing and ruined it. But when I was a little boy, it was a cheap, dirty, old theater. But it used to be a theater back when this book was written. And so they had a little piano pit in the front. Like you go to a theater now, there's nothing in front. There's just a row of chairs and a screen, and they show the movie up there. But this place used to be a place where they showed vaudeville shows where there'd be people juggling and doing magic acts and stuff. And so it had a stage. But in front of the stage was a pit that went down in the ground just a little bit lower, not like a hole in the ground. And there was a piano in it. And so we watched movies over the top of that piano. And my little brother and I loved to sit in the front row, even though the rest of my family, my older brother hated to sit in the front row. So they'd sit back there and we'd sit in the front row and watch the movie like this. Because we were still close enough that you had to lean back. It was so great. Anyway, yeah, the Liberty Theater was very, very old and was made back in the 1920s when this book would have been kind of the time period. So, kind of cool. The next day, there was a matinee at the neighborhood theater, and Mrs. Gray said they could go. It was a wonderful picture with Indians and cowboys and pioneers, and the children were very, very excited. But no sooner had they found their seats and settled back in the nice dark theater when first Susan, then Bobby, and finally Larry fell asleep. They slept peacefully through the entire picture. A Mickey Mouse cartoon, and a newsreel, because they would play a lot of... Back then, there was no television, and so you went to the movies, and you paid to get in, and I guess as long as you stayed there, you could watch whatever they played. And so kids would go in the morning and stay there for a long time. And, yeah, they slept through the whole thing. When the show was over, all the other children went home to dinner, but Larry and Susan and Bobby slept on. Susan was the first to awake. She sat up and rubbed her eyes. Where was she? Why was it so dark? Have you ever had that experience that you wake up, either you're so tired when you go to bed that you wake up in the morning and you don't know where you are, or what day it is, or when it is, or you go and you visit your aunt or your uncle's house and you go to bed and you're sleeping in a totally different place. It's not your room, it's not your bed, and you wake up and you don't know where you are for a minute, and then you have to remember. That's how they woke up in the movie theater, in the dark. Kind of scary. Where are they? Why is it so dark? Oh, how stiff and cramped she was. She poked Larry and Bobby until they too awoke. They were frightened when they realized that they were still in the theater, now dark and empty, except for 2 rats nibbling popcorn in the front row. Susan began to cry. Everybody's gone and left us, and we'll have to stay here until we die, she bawled. Larry said, Oh, Susan, don't be so silly. All we have to do is walk out the door. Come on, everybody. They groped their way up the aisle to the door, but it was locked. They tried all the doors, but they were all locked. Oh, no. Susan began to cry again. I'm hungry and I want to go home, she wailed. Bobby said, I'll bet there's a back way. Larry, let's look. The back way would be up on the stage and out the back door, which there was a way that way when I went to the Liberty Theater as a little boy. Sometimes we got to exit out the back of the stage, and you'd go behind the screen and everything, and there was a big, thick door into the alley, and you'd walk out the alley to back onto the street to where you parked your car. Pretty exciting stuff. They're going to try and do that. So Bobby said, I bet there's a back way, and Larry says, let's go look. They felt their way back down the aisle again and climbed up on the stage. Then suddenly, they heard the front door open. A flashlight's bold eye blinked in the darkness, and a voice said, Hey, what's going on here? What are you kids doing? It was Mr. Murphy, the janitor, and the children were so glad to see him that they ran and clung to his legs and all talked at once. "Oh, Mr. Murphy, we were locked in. We must have fallen asleep in the picture. What time is it? Will you let us out?" Mr. Murphy laughed at them. He's a crazy old coot. Let them out. He laughed at them and let them out the front door and drove them home. Mother and Daddy were in the living room playing bridge, which I've also never played. Have you played bridge? Maybe some of you have. It's what people used to play a lot of in all the shows I watched as a kid. The parents would play bridge with all their neighbors at some point during the week. With the Andersons next door, and seemed not at all surprised to see the children. Mrs. Gray said, "There's bread and milk on the kitchen table. Please put everything away when you finish," and went on with her game. The children ambled out to the kitchen, but they were too tired to eat, so they went upstairs and flung themselves across their beds. Flump! After they had rested for a while, Larry suggested that they play burglar. They turned off all the upstairs lights and crept around behind doors and under beds and had a fine, scary time until Larry pushed Bobby down the clothes chute. They have a clothes chute? Do you know what that is? The laundry chute. If the laundry was in the basement, then there would be a hole in the ceiling going all the way up through the house. And they build the house this way so that in the hallway or in the bedrooms, there'd be a little cupboard that you open the door of, and it's not a cupboard, it's a hole that goes all the way to the basement, and you put a laundry basket under that. I've never lived in a house that had one. Maybe some of you do. That's a pretty cool thing, because then you don't have to carry the laundry basket all the way down the steps. You just walk down there and there it is. Oh, of course you have to carry all the laundry back up. It's not an elevator. So that's what a laundry chute is. Larry pushed Bobby down the clothes chute. Oh, I hope it has a slide at the bottom, because otherwise he just dropped in the laundry bin. I keep on losing my place. Susan screamed, and Daddy came upstairs and yanked Bobby out. Oh, he didn't go all the way to the bottom. He got stuck. He spanked them all and sent them to their rooms. Susan and Bobby got right into bed and went to sleep, but Larry stayed awake until the guests had gone home and their mother and Daddy had gone to bed. Then he pinched Bobby awake, and they both sneaked into Susan's room and pulled off her covers. Larry said, "Let's go downstairs and see if there are any sandwiches or cookies left." Susan was very sleepy, but she said, "All right." They ate about 10 little sandwiches, a small dish of salted nuts, 2 little dishes of candy, some olives and pickles, and some chocolate marshmallow cake. They felt very lively after that, so they sat down at the bridge table and began playing slapjack. How do you play that? When they finished the last game, the birds were singing, and they heard the thump of the morning paper on the porch. They scurried up to bed quickly to pretend they'd been asleep all night. The next day was Patsy's birthday. Patsy was in another chapter here. It was a wonderful party with a fish pond and a magician who did tricks and games and balloons and prizes for every child, and Patsy was clean now. She wasn't covered in dirt. But Larry and Bobby and Susan did not enjoy it at all. Susan had such big black circles under her eyes that Patsy's mother thought she was sick and would not let her have any refreshments. Bobby was so sleepy he fell asleep just as the magician pulled a rabbit from under his chair, and the magician thought Bobby was so rude he gave the rabbit to Hubert Prentice. Larry fell asleep right at the table. He laid his cheek in his ice cream, closed his eyes, and dreamed he was in the North Pole. Patsy's mother called all the others to look at him, and he awoke very embarrassed. That night, when 8 o'clock came, Mr. and Mrs. Gray were working on the budget and not saying much, and Susan and Larry and Bobby were sitting on the Davenport, pinching each other to keep awake. At last, the clock struck. Bong, bong. You got to count the bongs. This is a grandfather clock that they have. I never lived in a house with a grandfather clock, but I've seen a couple. Back then, it would ring how many times the hour is. So, bong, 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 bong. I'm holding the book. Bong, 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 bong. The children jumped up and rushed out over to their mother and father. They said, "It is 8 o'clock and time for bed. Please let us go to bed. Please don't make us stay up anymore. Please." Now they're whining to go to bed. Mrs. Gray said, "Why, I thought you enjoyed staying up late. I thought all the children in this neighborhood stayed up late." The children said, "Nobody has to stay up late but us. We just hate it. May we please go to bed? Please." With 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 15 E's. I'm not going to count them all. Mrs. Gray said, "Very well, children. From now on, if you are good, I will let you go to bed at 8 o'clock every night." Can you believe that? I think Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle just tricks children for a living. She just figures out ways to trick you guys so much. None of you would be that weird to think that you could. Would you? If you got tired enough, would you beg your parents to please send you to bed? Can you imagine that? Wouldn't that be something? What an upside-down world. Hey, that's kind of like Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house. Her whole house is upside down. You know, this is an artistic sort of thing. I think that the person who wrote this book, her name is Betty McDonald. I bet Betty McDonald made Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house upside down as kind of a metaphor or a symbol of how she turns everybody else's houses upside down to help children see things differently. I think we just learned something about the whole entire book. Well, next week, who's she going to turn upside down? We have a little boy named Alan. It's chapter 7, and he is the slow eater, tiny bite taker cure. And I hope that none of you suffer from this malady of slow eating and tiny bite taking, making your meals take forever. But if you do, we're going to figure out how to cure it next week. Not next week. Sorry. That's from when I was a kid. You'd watch a show, and it'd be a whole week before you see the next one. And they'd say, "Join us next week. We'll find out what happens to Batman in this episode." But, yeah. No, tomorrow. Tomorrow, I will figure out what time, and we will read chapter 7. The Slow Eater, Tiny Bite Taker Cure. Thanks for watching.